Carried on the back of an October wind, the county wagon rolled into Harlan's Crossing just past noon, and Clara Doss stepped down from it with a flour sack of belongings and a paper in her hand that said she was temporary help. That was the word the county clerk had used, temporary, as though a woman's usefulness had an expiration date stamped somewhere on her wrist. She folded the paper once, tucked it into her coat pocket, and looked up at the flat gray sky above the Idaho high country. The mountains in the distance were already wearing their winter caps. She had until spring, the paper said, long enough to earn her keep and decide what came next. She had not planned to end up in Harlan's Crossing. She had not planned most of the last 2 years. Her sister's house in Boise had been kind until it wasn't, until the third mouth to feed became too much for a family that was already counting beans. The county had offered placement, honest work for board and wages, and Clara had said yes because yes was the only door still open. The man who met her at the wagon stop was not what she expected. Hugh Calloway stood about 6'2", lean as a fence rail, with a jaw that looked carved from the same granite as the mountains behind him. He wore a wool coat that had been mended at both elbows, and boots that were clean despite the mud of the road. He did not smile. He looked at her the way a man looks at a window that may or may not keep the cold out, with careful, measuring eyes. He said, "You're the county woman?" She said, "I'm Clara Doss. The county sent me." He nodded, once. "I'm Hugh Calloway. I have a daughter. She's 4. The arrangement is housekeeping, cooking, and minding Lily when I'm in the field. Wages are what the county set. You'll have the back room. Meals are shared." He picked up her flour sack before she could reach for it. "Wagons this way." That was the whole of their introduction. Clara followed him, and the county wagon turned around and left, and the wind came down off the mountains, like it had somewhere else to be. Dust rose and settled on the road behind them. Clara kept pace with Hugh's long stride, and reminded herself that she had faced harder beginnings. She was not sure she believed it, but she told herself anyway, and that, she had learned, was sometimes enough to make a thing true. Ransom had never entered her life as kindly as October entered Harlan's Crossing, cold and certain and asking nothing back. Hugh Calloway's homestead sat 3 miles east of town, tucked against a low ridge where a stand of cottonwoods had gone entirely gold. The house was small but square, built with the honest intention of keeping out weather. A covered porch ran the length of the front. 2 chairs sat out there, one large, one very small, and the sight of that small chair made something move in Clara's chest before she could stop it. She heard the child before she saw her. A high, clear voice came from inside the house, and then the front door banged open and a small girl appeared in the doorway, wrapped in an oversized sweater that hung past her knees. She had her father's dark eyes and a ribbon in her hair that someone had tied in haste, the bow listing badly to one side. "Papa," Lily Calloway called, ignoring the bow and the sweater and the cold alike. "Did you bring her? Mrs. Henshaw said you were bringing a lady." Hugh set Clara's flour sack on the porch steps. "I brought her," he said. "This is Miss Doss. She's going to help out around the house." Lily looked at Clara with the frank, unguarded assessment that only very small children can produce without cruelty. She studied Clara's coat, her boots, her face. "You have nice hair," Lily said finally. "Thank you," Clara said. "Your ribbon is crooked." Lily put a hand to her head. "Papa tied it." "I can see that," Clara said. She knelt without thinking and retied the bow, her fingers quick and sure. Lily stood very still, allowing this, with the patience of a child who has learned that some things must simply be endured and other things might turn out to be gifts. When Clara stood, Lily was smiling. Hugh watched all of this from 3 feet away and said nothing. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and something oniony left too long on the stove. Clara found a pot on the back burner, half full of something that had been meant to be soup and had become, Instead, a kind of paste. She looked at it, looked at the pantry, and began. Hugh stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment. "I'll be in the barn until supper," he said. "That's fine," Clara said, already tying an apron she found on the wall hook. "What time does Lily eat?" 6. The child eats first. He stopped. It was not a question she had asked. It was a statement of how things were going to be. He looked at her once more with those measuring eyes. Then he said, "Yes," and went out to the barn. Lily sat at the kitchen table and watched Clara work. She asked 17 questions in the space of an hour. Clara counted, about where Clara came from, whether she liked horses, whether she thought spiders were bad, or just misunderstood, and whether the moon was lonesome, or just quiet. Clara answered each one in turn, honestly, and without talking down. By the time the real supper was on the stove, Lily had pulled her small chair close enough to be underfoot, and Clara had stopped noticing the inconvenience. That first night after Lily was put to bed, Hugh did this himself, with a gentleness that Clara saw through the half-open door and then looked away from quickly, because it felt too private to watch. Hugh came back to the kitchen and stood at the table. "The county paper says 3 months," he said. "It does. That may not be enough time." She looked at him across the scrubbed pine surface. "Enough time for what, Mr. Calloway?" He looked at the wall instead of at her. "To sort things out," he said, and then he went to his room and shut the door, and Clara stood in the kitchen with the dying fire, and the question he hadn't answered, and she thought that Hugh Calloway was a man carrying a weight he had never once set down. The cottonwoods dropped their gold over the course of 10 days, and by the time November arrived, the homestead had settled into a kind of working rhythm. Clara rose first, before the light, and built up the kitchen fire. She learned quickly that Hugh took his coffee black and would not say so directly. He simply didn't reach for the sugar, and that Lily needed coaxing in the mornings, being the sort of child who came alive at noon and ran on pure light until dark. Clara learned the pantry, the woodpile, the particular draft that came through the east window above the sink, and the way the barn cat appeared at the back step each morning at 7 wanting milk and refusing to be called anything but cat. She mended things. She mended them because they needed mending, not because anyone asked. A tear in the knee of Lily's best dress, the hem of a curtain in the sitting room, a work shirt of Hugh's that had a button missing, and 2 more that were about to follow. She found the shirt on the mending pile one Tuesday morning, and she sat in the good light by the front window and put it to rights. Hugh found it folded on the table that evening. He held it up, turned it. He said, "You didn't have to do this." "The button was already gone," Clara said. "The others were loose. It would have happened in the field." He set the shirt down. He did not say thank you, not right away, but he looked at her in the particular way that meant he had taken account of something. Clara was learning to read that look. It was the closest thing Hugh Calloway had to an open door. On a Friday afternoon 3 weeks in, Lily came to Clara with a piece of paper. She had been given it at the church social where Mrs. Henshaw taught the small children their letters, and it had a line at the top that said, "Fill in your family." Below that there were 3 blanks, father, mother, and child. Lily had already filled in the first and the third. In the blank beside mother she had written Clara's name in careful, uneven letters. The L and the A were backwards and the R had a tail that went the wrong direction, but it was unmistakably Clara. Lily held it out. "I ran out of room for Doss," she said matter-of-factly. "But I got Clara." Clara looked at the paper for a long time. She was careful with her face. "That's very nice printing," she said. "You're the one here," Lily said simply, with the unassailable logic of a 4-year-old. Then she took the paper back and went to put it with her things. Clara turned back to the stove and stood there a moment, one hand on the pot handle, looking at nothing. The fire snapped. The wind pushed at the east window. She was temporary help. It said so on the county paper in her coat pocket. She reminded herself of this, quietly and firmly, the way you remind yourself of a thing you would rather forget. She did not move for the span of 10 breaths. Then she stirred the stew and did not think about it anymore, or tried not to. Hugh came in for supper and found her quieter than usual. He did not ask why, but he did not go to his room after the dishes were done. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee, and she sat across from him with her mending, and for an hour they were quiet together, in a way that was beginning, without either of them naming it, to feel like something other than silence. December arrived on a north wind with serious intentions. The first real snow fell on a Sunday and did not stop until Tuesday, and when Clara looked out the back window that second morning, she could not see the barn. Hugh had gone out at first light with a rope tied to his wrist at one end and the barn post at the other, and she had stood at the window and watched that rope disappear into the white until she couldn't look anymore. He came back in at mid-morning, ice on his beard and his hands red as creek clay. She had coffee ready. She set it in front of him and without thinking laid her own hand briefly over his to check the cold of them. The way you check whether a child has come in too chilled. She pulled her hand back quickly. He looked at his coffee and said nothing, but his shoulders came down a half-inch from where he'd been holding them. The snow made the house smaller in every good way. Lily took to spending the afternoons at the kitchen table while Clara baked, asking her endless questions, and occasionally being allowed to press the fork marks into the pie crust. She had decided that Clara's hair was her favorite thing about any person she had ever met, and she said so frequently and without apology. Clara took to braiding it in the mornings and putting in the pin she'd brought from her flour sack, and Lily would touch the pin reverently throughout the day. The trouble came from outside, as trouble in that country generally did. A man named Aldous Wren held the water rights to the creek that ran through the south edge of Hugh's grazing land. Wren was not a neighbor. He was a representative of the Meridian Land and Water Company out of Boise, and he had been buying up water agreements across the county for the better part of 2 years. He rode out to the Callaway place on the Thursday after the snow broke, with a second man at his elbow and a leather document case across his saddle. Clara opened the door because Hugh was in the south field. Wren looked at her with the flat eyes of a man who categorized people quickly and by use. "Is Callaway here?" "He's in the field. I can take a message." "I'll wait." He looked past her into the house with a deliberate kind of rudeness, as though checking the worth of the contents. "You can wait on the porch," Clara said. She did not move from the doorway. She let the silence sit there between them until he understood that she meant it. Then she closed the door, leaving him in the cold, and went for her coat. She walked to the south field herself, through the broken crust of snow, and found Hugh mending fence line. He listened to what she told him. His jaw tightened once, like a hand forming a fist, and then releasing. "Wren," he said. That's what he said his name was. Hugh pulled on his coat and started back. "He's been working through the county," he said, "picking off anyone whose water agreement isn't current. He bought the original charter on the creek last spring. Says anyone downstream owes him a fee or he'll file to divert. Can he do that? He's been doing it to the Garver place and the Miltons." He looked ahead at the house. "He's been waiting for me to fall behind." "Have you?" Hugh's mouth was a flat line. "I have not." Clara followed him back to the house. She had a thought, and she held it while they walked. By the time they reached the porch, she had turned it over enough. "When did your wife die?" she asked. The question came out plain and direct, the way Clara asked most things. She was not cruel, but she was honest. Hugh stopped with his hand on the door. He did not look at her. "February," he said, 2 years ago. "Did she handle the paperwork, the county filings?" A pause. "She did. Then there may be filings that didn't get renewed." He said nothing. He opened the door and they went in, and Wren was there on the porch with his case, and Hugh stepped out again with the calm of a man who had decided exactly how far he was willing to go and had made his peace with it. Clara lit the lamp in the kitchen and found Lily building a city with dried corn cobs on the floor, and went quietly to the sitting room, where Hugh kept a flat-top trunk that had been his wife's. She had seen the county seal on a folder once, lifting the lid to find extra candles. She opened the trunk now with a clear conscience. It was not snooping, it was necessary, and began to look. The confrontation on the porch was not loud. Clara could hear the measured cadence of Hugh's voice, low and certain, and Wren's sharper, more agitated responses. She kept looking through the trunk. She found what she needed in a tan envelope folded behind a bundle of letters. A water use certification, county stamped, filed before Margaret Calloway's death, dated, signed, legitimate. She carried it to the door. Hugh was on the porch with Wren, who was holding up his leather case and talking about legal process. Hugh stood in the way Hugh always stood, still as a post, steady as the ridge behind the house. He was not arguing. He was simply not moving, and sometimes that was the thing a man had that mattered most. Clara stepped out and handed Hugh the envelope without a word. He opened it. He looked at it for a moment. Then he handed it to Wren. Wren looked at it. His jaw shifted. He looked at Clara, and she held his gaze without expression, without apology, without invitation. She was temporary help, the county paper said so, but she stood on Hugh Calloway's porch like a woman who had dug in, and she knew it, and she didn't look away. "This is current," Wren said at last. "It is," Hugh said. Wren put the document back in the envelope and handed it to Hugh with a particular carefulness that meant he had nothing more to work with. He spoke a few words about the county records being reviewed, which was not a threat so much as a man looking for a door to leave by. Then he rode out with his companion, and the sound of the horses faded into the cold. Hugh stood on the porch a moment longer. He looked out at the road. Then he said, "Where did you find it?" "The trunk," Clara said. "The one in the sitting room. Margaret's trunk." "Yes." He turned. He was not a man who showed things easily, but he looked at her then with something she hadn't seen before. Not gratitude exactly, not relief exactly, something that lived in the country between those two things. "Thank you, Clara," he said. It was the first time he had said her name. She went inside before she could let it mean too much. The weeks after Wren's visit were quieter, but something had shifted in the house the way the light shifts in winter, without your noticing, until one afternoon it's different and you can't say when it changed. Hugh came to the kitchen table in the evenings instead of going to his room. He began to say things, small things at first, about the land, about what the spring planting might look like, about a fence post he meant to reset when the ground softened. Clara listened. She offered opinions when she had them. He listened to those. One evening, Lily fell asleep in her chair at the table before she'd finished her supper, her head tilting slowly forward until it rested on her folded arms, and Hugh got up without a word and lifted her as though she weighed nothing at all, and Clara watched the carefulness of his hands, the way he tucked the child's head against his shoulder, and she looked down at her own hands on the table and told herself, again, that she was temporary. 3 months, the paper said. The month of January was doing things to that certainty. A night came in the second week of the new year when the wind picked up hard from the north and the temperature dropped in the space of an hour to something cruel. Hugh was in the barn and Clara was at the stove and Lily was sleeping, and Clara could hear the wind find every crack and gap in the house with something like intent. She built the fire higher and checked the back door and found herself thinking about the 2 chairs on the porch and whether anyone would move them in, or whether they'd just stand there all winter, one big and one small, buried in snow. She didn't know why that thought sat so heavily on her. Hugh came in and stood by the kitchen fire to warm himself. Clara poured coffee. They stood together on opposite sides of the stove, and the fire was between them, and the wind was outside, and the house was holding. He said, "The paper from the county. What happens when the 3 months are up?" She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "They place me somewhere else, or I find a situation on my own." He looked at the fire. "What would you want if the choice were yours?" She considered telling him that the choice was never hers, that women of her particular circumstances didn't often have choices so much as they had better or worse versions of necessity. But she looked at him in the firelight, his mended coat, his careful hands, his face that had been working very hard all these weeks to feel nothing and had been quietly failing, and she said instead, plainly, "I would stay, if there were a reason to." He was quiet for a long moment. The fire snapped. Then he said, "Lily needs someone steady. The county paper treats you like your temporary help, but there is nothing temporary about what you've done here. I'm not a man who's easy to live with. I know that about myself." He looked up from the fire. "I'm asking whether you'd consider something more permanent. It wouldn't start out as—" He stopped. He started again. "I'm asking if you'd marry me, for Lily's sake, and because this house is better for having you in it. I know that's not—" "Yes," she said. He stopped. "You didn't let me finish. You were going to say it's not a romantic offer," Clara said. "I know what this is, Hugh. I know what we both need, and I know that there are worse ways for a thing to start." She looked at him squarely. "Yes." Something moved behind his eyes, not the door opening, more like a curtain shifted. He said, "All right," in the voice of a man for whom that word covered considerable territory. Clara set down her cup and said, "I'll want a shelf in the kitchen, for my things." "I'll build it," he said. "And Lily's chair needs a new leg. It wobbles. I know it does. And I'll want the recipe for whatever you tried to make in that pot my first week here, so I can understand what I'm working against." He made a sound then that she hadn't heard from him before. It was low and brief, but it was entirely unmistakable. It was a laugh. Clara looked at the fire so he wouldn't see her smile and make it too easy for him. They were married on a Saturday in late February by the pastor of the Harlan's Crossing Church, with Mrs. Henshaw as witness, and Lily standing between them in her best dress, the ribbon in her hair tied by Clara's sure hands, perfectly even. Lily held both their fingers for the duration of the ceremony, one in each of her small fists, and when the pastor said the final words, she looked up at Clara with the uncomplicated certainty of a child who has decided where she belongs. The county paper, the one that named Clara temporary help, had been in her coat pocket since October. She had carried it without thinking much about it, the way you carry something you expect you'll need to refer to again. She took it out that morning before she dressed, read it once, folded it neatly, and laid it on the kitchen table. She did not put it back in her pocket. She had not needed to refer to it again. Spring came the way spring comes to Idaho high country, tentatively at first, then with sudden conviction. The cottonwoods put out new growth, the south fields softened. Hugh was out at dawn each morning, and Clara had his coffee ready, and Lily had begun to draw pictures of 3 people and a cat at a table, which she gave to Clara with the solemn seriousness of a child who intends her art to be understood. Hugh built the kitchen shelf on a Sunday in March. He measured it twice and cut it true, and set it level against the wall beside the window, and when it was done he said, "That'll hold what you need." Clara had 4 things to put on it: a small tin of tea, the pin she'd brought from her flour sack, a river stone she'd picked up somewhere along the road from Boise because it fit in her hand like it was made for it, and the paper that Lily had brought home from the church social, the fill-in-your-family paper, with father and child filled in, and Clara written in careful, reversed letters in the mother blank. She set that last one where the light would catch it. Hugh saw it there later. He didn't say anything. But when Clara looked up from the stove, he was looking at the shelf with an expression that was not nothing, and she turned back to her work and was glad. That spring, Lily began calling her Mama, without ceremony or announcement, the way children begin doing a thing they have been privately deciding for months. Clara answered to it the first time with a simple yes, and did not make more of it than it was, because Lily didn't need her to. Some things just become true. You live forward into them and they settle. Hugh heard it happen, the first time, from the doorway. He said nothing. But that evening he fixed the wobbling leg on Lily's chair without being reminded, and he set it back at the table, and the three of them ate supper in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and bread, and the particular warmth of a house that has figured out what it is. There is something this story asks you to sit with, friend. It is a simple thing. Sometimes the paper that governs your life has the wrong word on it. The county wrote temporary, and it was wrong, because Clara Doss walked into a house that needed her, and she stayed, not because of any document, but because a child wrote her name in a blank space, and she was honest enough to admit what that meant. The official forms will tell you who you are for a season, but acts of care tell the longer truth. A mended shirt, a straightened ribbon, a warm cup handed across a stove in a January wind. These are the things that build a family, not the paperwork, not the proper words, the acts. If this story found something in your heart tonight, leave a comment and tell us. Have you ever found yourself somewhere you didn't expect to be and discovered it was exactly where you needed to stay? We'd love to hear from you. And if you'd like more Old West journeys like this one, with all their hardship and warmth and hard-won love, please subscribe and ride along with us. There are more stories on this trail, and we'll be here for every one of them. Good night. God bless you, and keep going. The spring always follows.